Hello, in this video, we're going to talk about using React component libraries. So one of the main benefits of working with React is that React has us define our application in terms of these self-contained components. A component, right, a portion of our page is designed to sort of manage itself. It might contain its own state. It takes in some props as inputs, but it kind of controls what it does. It becomes its own little sort of isolated section of a page. We can see that we did that with our React chat application, right, where we had like our composing form, right? Our form was its own little thing that could be used in lots and lots of different places, right? We could just specify that we want to reuse that component, that form, whenever we're interested in for any kind of text-based form entry, and it just takes in as a prop of what to do with that text entry. So the idea here is that because we have these components that are sort of designed to do one thing and then kind of be drag and dropped into different, sort of added in randomly into different applications, people have built these components for React for many years, and they have published them, made them available on the web for other people to use. And you can go find these things by just looking around. So, for example, if we go to NPM's registry, so this is the sort of the website that's a listing of all the different packages that are available on NPM. And if you search for React, you'll actually be able to find 6,000 different packages that are involved React in some way. Right? This includes React and React DOM, but also a bunch of other pieces that are used for doing different kinds of behaviors and support for writing React, right? Ways of letting you write React a little bit faster, ways of sort of letting you be able to test it better, ways of letting you be able to do different kinds of effects. So what often can end up happening is that if you're looking for some kind of widget, right, some kind of aspect of your page that you want to be able to use without having to code it up yourself, you can often find those inside of NPM or inside of sort of other registries. For example, if you want to be able to put a clock on your web page, right, you could search for a React clock, and you can find a bunch of different components that look like clocks, right? They create clocks for your React app. If we go and look at what one of these things is, right, they can the hub, this one has a little demo. Right? It creates a little clock for you to use that ticks and tells the time. We can build out and include these kinds of components as ways of making us have functionality in our applications without having to write it, code it up, and sort of do all that work ourselves. We can reuse the work that others have done. You can find things like clocks, calendars are really common. And there's a lot of different calendar systems, a lot of different kinds of date picking stuff. And you'll often find lots of different examples of these packages that will do different things, right? Or they all work in, they do the same thing, but they do it in slightly different ways. So this then becomes kind of an exploration, researching kind of behavior where we need to then go look into this package, study its documentation, study its sort of things like when it was last updated, how recently it's been used, whether it has a lot of outstanding problems or issues, and we can make judgment calls on whether this application, this package, might solve our problem, right? It might provide some of the code we want to use, right? Provide sort of a functionality we want without us having to write it ourselves. So that's the idea of how we can use these various packages, these libraries that exist out in the world. Let's go through an example of how we might want to build these things, use one of these things. So in our React chat app that we were working on in the sort of from previous videos, we had a set of different buttons that we used to switch between different users, right? So I was able to click on a different user, and it was able to then switch to see which one I'm trying to work with. Of course, that's kind of a weird interface, right? You generally don't have a list of all your users at the top. It might be really nice to have something like a drop-down menu, right? Where I can click on a button and then it drops down a list and pops up a list of which users I want to be able to click on in order to be able to sort of select one. And that might just kind of clean up my interface and makes it look better. Now, we could code that up ourselves, right? We can go ahead and design the HTML and the CSS and sort of the state-based rendering to be able to make sure that when you click this button, it now displays the drop-down or doesn't display the drop-down and makes that work. But as you might recall, Bootstrap also had drop-down menus, right? We've seen drop-downs when we're looking at Bootstrap widgets, right? Bootstrap actually has really nice drop-downs, right? Where we have a button and it drops down, has a bunch of other things, actions that get supported from that. So it's really, really nice if, similar to when we were using Bootstrap for CSS and even for Bootstrap for DOM level interactivity, if we could use that in React, right? I would like to be able to just drop in an element, right, a button that has a toggle that says make this a drop down. I'd like to be able to just have that work the same way it did with Bootstrap. Now, the thing is we can't just put Bootstrap immediately into React applications. The reason this is because the dropdowns and all these interactive components that we get from Bootstrap, which includes things like dropdowns, collapsibles, accordions, modals, all these different pieces require using JavaScript, right? DOM level JavaScript, in particular using sort of what's a system called Popper, which is really built on top of jQuery. So those are sort of other libraries and other JavaScript code that's designed to interact with and modify the DOM. The thing is that React is controlling the DOM, right? React is choosing what content we're rendering and when we're rendering at any given time. And in order for React to do this efficiently, we can't try to control the DOM on our own outside of the React system, right? We can't include some other JavaScript code that starts modifying and working with the DOM, because then React is going to be like, well, no, you've now changed it from what I want it to be. It's going to try to change it back. It's going to just try to like suddenly lose track of what's going on, or it says like, oh, I thought I was going to change something, but it looks like it's already been changed, and it gets confused. So we can't just use drop in JavaScript to work with React. We can't drop in jQuery. We can't do DOM calls. We have to do it through React itself. Luckily, though, at the same time, like doing Bootstrap's widgets are the kinds of things we want to do in React. So there are libraries that will do that work. If we Google for doing Bootstrap and React together, I don't want to stick that aside in, we'll actually be able to find a library called React Bootstrap. And what React Bootstrap will do is React Bootstrap provides us a set of React components that do dropdown work, that do these kinds of behaviors, so that we can go find in our list of components. Sorry, my page is a little large. We can go find our dropdowns and be able to literally find drop-down effects that work with and inside of React. So if we want to include Bootstrap components like Bootstrap widgets, right? Not necessarily Bootstrap styling, right? All the CSS stuff we just include as CSS because that's not JavaScript, it's not React level work. But any of the interactive components, right? Any of the things that would have required you to include Bootstrap's JavaScript, we can instead use React Bootstrap as a library to do that work. I'm going to note that there's actually a couple of different libraries that will do Bootstrap in React. For a long time, I recommended one called ReactStrap because that had better structuring, better documentation. It was more up to date with Bootstrap. However, that stopped being maintained as much. Now React Bootstrap is considered kind of the current best one. It stays up to date with Bootstrap, with kind of Bootstrap 5 is working the best way. So that's the recommended library to use. Be very careful about which one you're using. Don't mix and match them because they're going to conflict with each other because they're both trying to do the same thing. I also want to be really clear that React Bootstrap is the library that's going to give us interactivity, right? It gives us the ability to do things like carousels and drop-downs and modals. Bootstrap, right, without React, just the Bootstrap part, right? Bootstrap here is all about styling. So if we're trying to just create things that look nice, or we're trying to use things like cards, things like the sort of the styling utilities that we've used before, that doesn't require any special React libraries. That's just Bootstrap on its own. So those are two different pieces. All right, so let's go ahead and actually add in as a dropdown and sort of see how this works. So in order to use a React library, there are 4 steps. And you always do these 4 steps no matter what library you're doing. They're kind of high-level steps. So the first thing you have to do is you have to figure out what library, what components you want to use. You have to go find it, right? You Google for React calendars or React dropdowns. You search NPM for React Bootstrap things, or you just like hear about it because I told you that React Bootstrap exists, and so you go find it and figure out that's the library I want to use. So we might say, okay, this React Bootstrap, this is the thing that I want to use. We want to make sure we read through the documentation because that will tell us how to actually use this thing. And often these components are all used in slightly different ways. They're pretty similar in structure, but they might be variations between what you need to import, what kind of props they're going to take, what kind of potential state variables you need to create on your own. There's lots of different pieces. We'll need to make sure we read through that documentation. So we look at React Bootstrap, there's some documentation about, for example, how to get started, and we can learn things about how to do installation, how to sort of manage importing components and why we might do that, as well as some other pieces as well that's relevant. All right, similar to what that Getting Started guide says to do, the next step is we need to install the library. We need to make sure that JavaScript code, that component code, is available for us to use. We're going to install it as a package similar to how we've installed Bootstrap as packages, similar to how we've installed React as packages. We're going to install it as a package, a library for us to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that on our command line. And so I think I'm in the right place here. So in order to install a new library, we're going to generally, because we're using npm as our package manager, we're going to use the command npm install and then the name of the library. Note, we're not using npm install -g. We're not installing this globally, right? Because we're not trying to install it as like an application for our computer to run. We're just trying to install it as another library, as another tool, a dependency that's used in our application. So if we look at our documentation for React Bootstrap, it'll tell us what we need to install, right? What the name of the library is. In this case, we're npm installing React Bootstrap. Most libraries and packages are kind of named after themselves, right? If the library is called React Bootstrap, you're going to install React Bootstrap, but not always. So you need to double check to make sure like what the name of that library is. Be careful about putting in the wrong name. That's actually a good source of malicious code, is people will try to like sit on bad, sort of like mistyped package names, the same way people will sit on mistyped domain names on the web. And so just be a little bit careful about that. Note that it's also telling us that we'll want to install Bootstrap as a library itself. Luckily, we've already done that in our package, right? If we look at our, come on. Why are you not showing me everything I want to see? All right, give me a second. I don't want to re-record this video, so I'm just going to keep going with the same system. All right. All right, there we go. Now we're back to where we used to be. We wanted to go back to our header bar because that's what we're playing with. So if we look at our package.json, right, we've already got Bootstrap installed, so we don't need to install Bootstrap as well. We can just install React Bootstrap. So we're going to do that. We're going to do npm install React Bootstrap. And that will now download this package and install it into our repository. It's going to add it into our node modules folder, right? Where that's a list of all the local dependencies are for this project. So if we now look at node modules and we scroll down a really long ways, because there's a lot of these things, we can eventually find where to go. There it is. There's React Bootstrap. There's what we've downloaded. Here's all the code we've downloaded to get all of React Bootstrap working. You'll note that it's also been added to our... It should be added to our dependencies. Wait, hold on. Installed React Bootstrap. Why are you not being started? I mean, refresh it. There we go. My VS Code's not refreshing automatically. So it also gets added to our list of dependencies, which means that, for example, if we then install this package and we give this application to, say, a group member or someone else who's also working on this project, they can just run npm install, and it'll automatically install any missing dependencies. So they can just rerun npm install as many times as they want, and it will always install anything that's missing. And if nothing's missing, then nothing happens. We're all good to go. So that will add this in as a dependency. Great. Okay, so that's the next step. We install it. Once we've done that, we then need to say, here's a component I want to use, so I need to import that component. So we're going to do that the same way we've imported components before, right? The same way inside of our, for example, inside of our app, we imported the header bar component that we wrote. We imported the channel list component that we wrote. In our header bar, we want to use our dropdown. We're going to import the dropdown component that we want to use. Now, the main thing you're going to want to watch out for is whether or not components are going to be imported as named imports or as default imports, right? Are you going to write something like import button from React Bootstrap, or are you going to import brackets button from React Bootstrap, right? Is it a named import or a default import? And it varies depending on the library. Some do default, some do named, some do both. React Bootstrap does both and actually lets you specify how you want to do it. It recommends you use a default import from React Bootstrap / the sort of the name of the component. This is going to let us import just the button or just the dropdown and not the entire React Bootstrap library and then only like access the button, right? So rather than saying like, so let's just get the button but import the whole library, we're going to say import just the button and we'll get that, and that's the piece I want to use. So that's the piece that we're interested in. If we go to, again, our documentation and I go to our components for dropdown, we can sort of look at our example to see how this gets imported and how this gets used. And in this case, from looking just at the example directly, please stop doing that. we can import dropdown from React Bootstrap's dropdown folder, right? So we're gonna go to the dropdown folder inside of React Bootstrap and go import the default export and call it dropdown. So we can do that work. That. So we can import our dropdown. So that's step what, 3, right? We always import these things. And again, the import structure might vary depending on the library. The last step now is that because we've imported this component is we can render it, right? We can include it as part of our returned DOM the same way we've rendered any other component that we wrote. Now we're just using a component that somebody else wrote. Again, it's just like with Bootstrap CSS, right? It's just as if we had written that CSS ourselves. We're just happening to use CSS rules that someone else wrote. In this case, we're using JavaScript React components that someone else has written. So we look at our example here. We've got a really basic example, and it's like dropdowns are a little bit complex, but roughly you can see that it's rendering a dropdown, and then it's also rendering some other components inside of that: dropdown toggles, dropdown menus, dropdown items, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's fine. What we can do to actually see how this works is similar to what we did with Bootstrap. Is let's just try it out. Let's use this example code and see what we get. So in our rendering here, right, where I'm normally putting my user buttons, just right on next to them, I'm going to go ahead and put this drop-down code. And we're going to see what we get. So I run that drop-down code right now. I'm rendering it. So my header is now going to include an H1, my user buttons, and this sample drop-down from React Bootstrap. With that in place, you can now see that in my header, I've got my H1, I've got my user buttons, and I've got my sample dropdown. Great. Now, that's a good place to start. So we know it works. Now we just need to figure out how to make it work the way we want. And we can read through a lot of the documentation here about what all these different components do. There's a lot of examples in this because it looks like Bootstrap's documentation. But we can eventually, if we go farther enough down, we can get down to the API, to the actual documentation of what kinds of components exist, what props they support, and how you might want to put in different props on them. Note this supports an on-click prop, which just gets passed through as on-clicking, so that works exactly the same way. There's sort of alignments. We can see a bunch of different aspects. We can go look through the documentation to see exactly what kinds of options are available to us. Often you can start with examples and just be like kind of interpret the example code to understand how that works. And then if you want to do something specific, you can go dig through the documentation to figure out what you need. So things I'm going to look at, right? I know that I don't want this to be a drop down. I don't want to say, if I'm looking at what my code is, I don't want to say drop down button, and that's what this text appears to be. I want to show the current logged in user, right? So let's go ahead and I'm just going to replace that text with my current user, right? I got my current, because I've got my current user variable, right? That's one of my props that got passed in. So I'm going to use my current user's image and my current user's avatar. Username. All right, so that image goes in there. All right, and there we go. Now I've got the current user's name is appearing in my little drop-down line where that button used to be, which is great. I can get rid of IDs because I don't need an ID for this. That's not relevant. Variant success, that looks like that button success, button failure. Remember, those are our different kind of default coloring structures. Well, I don't want it to be green by default. I want it to be the same blue as my background because I want it to just kind of look like a kind of a fake button there. So if we give this a variant of primary, now it looks blue, right? Now I got my drop down that has a blue thing there. Cool. And that's rendering this drop down toggle class, right? That's a toggle property class of the drop down thing that we imported. So that's how we can render that. We then have the menu, which is the 3 things we want that are in my drop-down list, right? In my drop-down, I've got action, another action, something else. And those are being written as drop-down items, action, another action, something else. So what we might think to do is I don't necessarily need these to be these drop-down items, which have their own kind of styling and supporting thing. What we might actually just try doing is saying, actually, we will use drop-down items. That works fine. But I want to have these 3 items the same way I normally would have had all these different images. So what we can actually do here is we can go back up to where we were producing that set of images, right? Remember, we were rendering a set of buttons, all of which had those elements. And instead of rendering button elements that have the image inside of them, let's instead render these drop-down item elements. So literally, that's the only change I'm going to make. I'm going to make it so that instead of having it be instead of user buttons being a list of button elements, it's a list of drop-down item elements. And everything else stays the same. We got the same classes, we got the same keys, we got the same names on clicks, all that same stuff is the same. It's just now going to be a different element type. We can then remove the drop-down items from this list and instead put in our user buttons. But remember, our user buttons aren't actually buttons. Our user buttons are now these drop-down items. And with that in place, we now get the behavior we wanted, right? I now have a drop-down that has all of my different elements, and these are the same buttons, so I can still click on them and change user just the way I wanted. And of course, we can do some other cleanup to make this work a little bit better. Right now that we have this user image, I could put, for example, the user object.user's name next to it. And that makes it so now it shows the name of the person who's in there alongside of the element that the user I want to switch to, right? So I can switch to penguin, switch to zebra, and so forth. We can do some other work to, for example, get rid of the null and so forth, but that's going to give us the basic idea. With that in place, that lets us now, you have a drop-down, right? I've now written out a drop-down, which is this nice kind of interactive widget piece. It's not like a functional feature of my application. It's just a way of being able to display content in a different way. Without me needing to write that on my own, I was able to just use Bootstrap's example. And with that, we were able to use libraries to render additional components. So again, React Bootstrap has things like drop-downs. It has things like the nav bar drop-downs are inside of here as well. If you want to have like your collapsible nav bars, you can keep using that from Bootstrap. It has things like modals. I always show off modals because most law students often like using them, right? Which are sort of the pop-up windows that can happen. And again, it's got some instruction and some examples on how you might do that and how it works in order to be able to include and render that in your application. There are lots and lots of different libraries out there, right? You can go through NPM. Often the way you want to think about this is if there's a particular widget, right? Don't think of it, here's what my application is going to do, but here's like a little widget I want to include. A clock, calendar, a status bar, right? Some kind of animated thing. Like here's like some little piece of my application that feels like something that you might have seen that exact thing in another site somewhere. You can probably find a library that'll let you do that. What you'll do is you find the library, you choose that, you look through its documentation and its details to decide if it's what you want to do. You install it, you import the component, and you render the component as if you had written it yourself. And ta-da, you now have additional functionality.